Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the drug that literally turned people into zombies, except this wasn't a movie and the victims couldn't be stopped with a headshot. Krokodil made your flesh rot off your bones while you were still alive, conscious, and desperately injecting more. Imagine your skin turning green and scaly like a crocodile, which is precisely why Russian addicts named it that. Because when you're watching your arm dissolve into a putrid mass of exposed muscle and bone, you need some gallows humour to cope. The Soviet Union spent decades trying to create the perfect socialist citizen, and post-Soviet Russia accidentally created the perfect horror story instead. Here's the punchline. Krokodil exists because Russia tried to solve its heroin problem. The government cracked down on heroin trafficking, congratulated itself on reducing supply, and watched as desperate addicts invented something 10 times worse. Brilliant strategy. It's like eliminating rats by introducing cobras, then wondering why everyone's getting bitten by cobras. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. To understand how Krokodil became Russia's nightmare, you first need to understand what happens when an empire collapses and leaves millions of people with nothing but rage, poverty, and very bad ideas. The Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991, taking with it the entire economic system, social safety nets, and any illusion that the future would be better than the past. By the early 2000s, Russia had transformed into a capitalist experiment run by oligarchs who treated the country like a fire sale. Unemployment ravaged entire regions, particularly in Siberia and the industrial heartlands where factories shut down overnight. Pensioners discovered their life savings were worthless. Young men found no jobs waiting after military service, and entire towns watched their economies evaporate like vodka on a hot stove. Into this vacuum rushed heroin from Afghanistan, flooding across borders that barely existed anymore. The drug arrived via Central Asian routes, carried by traffickers who understood that desperate people make excellent customers. Russian heroin addiction rates exploded during the 1990s and early 2000s, creating what epidemiologists called one of the fastest growing drug crises in modern history. By 2005, Russia had approximately 1.5 million registered heroin addicts, with actual numbers likely double that because Russian statistics have always been creative works of fiction. Young men, mostly between 18 and 35, formed the core demographic, though the drug respected no boundaries of age, gender, or former social status. Heroin addiction in Russia wasn't recreational. It was industrial-scale self-medication for a generation that watched their country become unrecognizable. The high provided temporary escape from unemployment, hopelessness, and the grinding realization that nobody was coming to help. Users injected in abandoned Soviet-era apartment buildings, in basements, in parks, in bathroom stalls, anywhere they could find a vein and a moment of peace. Overdoses mounted, HIV spread through shared needles, and hepatitis became so common that having it barely registered as a health concern. Russian hospitals lacked resources to treat the epidemic, and society treated addicts as criminals rather than patients with a medical condition. Then the government decided to get tough on drugs. Around 2003-2004, Russian authorities launched a massive crackdown on heroin trafficking. Police raided supply routes, arrested dealers, increased border controls, and publicly announced victory over the drug menace. Politicians gave speeches about protecting Russian youth from foreign poisons, conveniently ignoring that Russian youth were injecting foreign poisons because Russian society had failed them completely. The crackdown worked, technically. Heroin supplies decreased dramatically in many regions, particularly outside major cities. Prices spiked from $20–$30 per dose to $50–$70 in areas where the drug could still be found. Street purity dropped as dealers cut their product with anything available. Heroin addicts facing withdrawal don't quietly accept their fate. Opiate withdrawal feels like every cell in your body is simultaneously on fire and freezing, like your bones are breaking from the inside, like you're dying slowly over the course of days. The human body, once dependent on opiates, demands them with an intensity that overrides every other consideration, including dignity, morality, and self-preservation. Russian addicts needed a solution, and they found one in an unexpected place: pharmacy shelves. Codeine, a weak opiate traditionally used for cough suppression and mild pain relief, remained available over the counter in Russian pharmacies throughout the early 2000s. The pills were cheap, legal, and contained just enough opiate to keep withdrawal at bay for a few hours. But codeine is to heroin what a flashlight is to the sun, barely adequate and deeply unsatisfying for someone with a serious addiction. Some addicts simply swallowed handfuls of codeine pills, which barely helped and destroyed their livers. Others discovered something more interesting: chemistry. Street chemists, often addicts themselves who'd retained some education from Soviet technical schools, began experimenting with codeine conversion. The chemical structure of codeine is remarkably similar to morphine, requiring only minor molecular modifications to transform one into the other. With the right reagents and process, anyone with basic chemistry knowledge could convert cheap codeine into something much stronger. Several processes circulated through Russian drug networks during this period, ranging from relatively safe to absolutely catastrophic. The worst process won, because it always does. Desomorphine entered the picture like a demon someone summoned without reading the fine print. The drug wasn't new. Swiss chemists first synthesized it in 1932 as a potential morphine replacement. Early studies showed it was 8 to 10 times more potent than morphine, with faster onset and shorter duration. Pharmaceutical companies tested it briefly under brand names like Permanid, then abandoned it because the side effects were considered unacceptable. This was the 1930s, when pharmaceutical companies would sell you cocaine lozenges and heroin cough syrup, so unacceptable side effects meant something truly horrifying. Desomorphine caused severe tissue damage at injection sites, respiratory depression more intense than morphine, and physical dependence that made heroin addiction look gentle. Nobody manufactured desomorphine legally after the 1950s, and it disappeared into obscure medical literature where it should have stayed forever. But Russian addicts in the 2000s weren't reading medical journals about why desomorphine had been abandoned. They were reading underground chemistry forums about how to make it in a kitchen using codeine pills and household chemicals. The recipe spread through Russian drug networks like a virus, passed from addict to addict, city to city, region to region. Someone discovered you could cook codeine with iodine, red phosphorus from matchboxes, and organic solvents into a crude approximation of desomorphine. The process took 30 to 45 minutes from start to finish. Addicts could make it themselves without relying on dealers or supply chains. The cost was minimal compared to heroin, roughly $3–8 per dose versus $30–50 for heroin in areas where heroin could still be found. The high hit faster than heroin, producing intense euphoria within 2–3 minutes of injection, compared to 10–15 minutes for heroin. For addicts facing withdrawal and empty pockets, these advantages seemed miraculous. The disadvantages took longer to become apparent. Desomorphine's high only lasted 90 minutes to 2 hours, compared to heroin's 4 to 8 hours, meaning users needed multiple injections per day just to stay functional. The synthesis process left behind a toxic soup of unreacted chemicals, heavy metals, and corrosive compounds that most users injected without any purification steps, because purification required time, knowledge, and equipment they didn't have. The recipe used gasoline or paint thinner as solvents, because they were cheaper than proper laboratory chemicals. Red phosphorus scraped from matchboxes contained numerous contaminants. Iodine solutions picked up from pharmacies came mixed with other compounds. None of these chemicals were meant to enter human bloodstreams. All of them did anyway, multiple times daily, accumulating in tissue with each injection. The mixture earned its street name from the first obvious symptom. Injection sites turned dark and scaly, resembling crocodile skin. Users initially dismissed this as a minor side effect, no worse than the collapsed veins and track marks heroin left behind. They were catastrophically wrong, but by the time they understood this, addiction had them in a grip stronger than any concern for their deteriorating bodies. The perfect storm had arrived. Post-Soviet economic collapse provided the desperation. Government heroin crackdowns eliminated the safer alternative, available codeine supplied the raw material, and accessible household chemicals made the synthesis possible. Russian addicts found themselves cooking flesh-eating poison in their kitchens because every other option had been systematically removed. The Krokodil epidemic was born not from individual bad choices, but from systemic failure at every level of society, government, and public health policy. By 2006-2007, the drug had spread across Western Russia and into Siberia. Users developed their own cooking techniques, shared recipes, and taught each other the process. Small groups formed around individuals who knew chemistry or had access to ingredients. Abandoned buildings became improvised laboratories where addicts cooked batch after batch. The smell of chemicals and burning phosphorus became familiar in certain neighborhoods, a warning sign that something terrible was happening, but nobody quite understood what yet. The Russian government and medical establishment initially failed to recognize what was emerging. Doctors saw patients with severe injection site infections, but attributed them to dirty needles and poor injection hygiene. Police occasionally raided cooking operations, but treated them as minor drug manufacturing cases. Media outlets ignored the story because who cares about what happens to drug addicts in forgotten Russian cities? The epidemic grew in shadows, spreading through populations nobody was watching, destroying bodies nobody would miss until the damage became too obvious to ignore. Krokodil had arrived and it was hungry. The recipe for Krokodil reads like instructions for creating a chemical weapon, which is essentially what it is, except the target volunteers to be attacked. Start with codeine-containing pills, the kind sold in any Russian pharmacy for coughs and headaches. Crush them into powder, typically 20 to 30 pills containing 15 milligrams of codeine each. Add iodine, the antiseptic solution people use for cuts. Mix in red phosphorus, scraped meticulously from the striking strips of matchboxes because buying pure phosphorus raises questions. Pour in gasoline as a solvent, or if gasoline isn't available, paint thinner works just as well. Introduce hydrochloric acid to help the chemical reaction proceed. Heat the mixture carefully, watching as it bubbles and releases toxic fumes that burn the lungs and eyes. The entire process takes roughly 30 to 45 minutes from ingredient assembly to finished product. Experienced cooks could complete it faster, racing against withdrawal symptoms that made hands shake and stomachs convulse. The chemical reaction converts codeine into desomorphine through a series of steps that would horrify any legitimate chemist. Iodine and red phosphorus react to form hydroiodic acid, which then reduces the codeine molecule by removing specific chemical groups. What emerges is technically desomorphine, buried inside a toxic cesspool of everything else in the mixture. Here's where the horror really begins. Nobody purifies it. Meth cooks, for all their numerous flaws, at least attempt purification steps. They wash their product, recrystallize it, try to remove some contaminants because even criminals understand that purity matters when creating something people will consume. Krokodil users skip every purification step because each one takes time, requires additional chemicals, and most importantly reduces the final volume of product. An addict in withdrawal cannot wait 2 extra hours to purify his dose. The mathematics of addiction override the mathematics of chemistry, resulting in a decision to inject absolutely everything in the cooking vessel. The liquid that results is brownish red, murky, and carries the distinct smell of gasoline and iodine. Users draw it into syringes through cotton filters or cigarette filters, which remove solid particles but do nothing for dissolved chemicals. Every compound that went into the mixture comes out in the final product. Unreacted iodine, phosphorus compounds, gasoline hydrocarbons, paint thinner residues, hydrochloric acid, codeine metabolites, binders and fillers from the pills, and somewhere in this toxic soup, the decamorphine they're actually seeking. The dosage is complete guesswork. Maybe the batch contains 100 milligrams of decamorphine, maybe 50, maybe 200. The concentration varies wildly depending on cooking technique, ingredients, and pure chance. Users inject and hope, adjusting their next dose based on whether the previous one worked or left them still sick with withdrawal. This trial and error approach works until it doesn't, and when it doesn't, users either get no effect or overdose and stop breathing. But they do it anyway because the economics are impossible to resist. A single dose of heroin in rural Russia during the late 2000s cost $30 to $50, assuming you could find heroin at all. That same amount of money could buy enough codeine pills to make 10 to 15 doses of Krokodil. A pack of matches cost pennies. Iodine ran about $2 per bottle. Gasoline cost whatever you could siphon from a car or motorcycle. The total investment for a day's worth of Krokodil might be $5 to $10, achievable even for unemployed addicts through begging, petty theft, or selling scrap metal. The high reinforced the choice. Heroin takes 10 to 15 minutes to reach peak effects after injection, a wait that feels eternal to someone in withdrawal. Krokodil hits in 2 to 3 minutes, slamming into the brain with intensity that briefly erases every problem, every pain, every reason life feels unbearable. The euphoria rivals or exceeds heroin for those first few minutes. Breathing slows, warmth spreads through the body, and the world becomes soft and distant. Then it ends. 90 minutes later, sometimes 2 hours if you're lucky, reality returns with interest. The high evaporates faster than alcohol, faster than cocaine, faster than almost any drug except maybe crack. Users describe feeling completely sober within 2 hours, followed rapidly by the creeping onset of withdrawal. This short duration meant Krokodil addicts needed to inject 4 to 6 times daily just to avoid getting sick, compared to 2 to 3 times for heroin users. The frequency of injection multiplied every risk factor. Each time a needle entered a vein, more gasoline accumulated in tissues. Each injection deposited more iodine, more phosphorus, more acid. The human body has no mechanism to eliminate gasoline efficiently. It simply stores it in fat tissue where it sits, causing low-level toxicity. Heavy metals like phosphorus compounds accumulate in bones and organs. The acids burn through blood vessel walls, creating weak points that balloon into aneurysms or simply burst. Russian addicts understood they were injecting poison. They weren't stupid or ignorant. They knew gasoline didn't belong in veins. But withdrawal trumps logic every time, and the alternative was either expensive heroin they couldn't afford or suffering through withdrawal without any relief. Given those options, injecting gasoline seemed like a reasonable compromise. The damage was supposed to come later, after the immediate crisis of withdrawal passed, except later arrived much faster than anyone anticipated. The cooking process itself became a communal activity in many areas. Groups of 3 to 5 users would pool their resources, designate someone with steady hands to handle the chemicals, and share the resulting product. Cooking locations range from abandoned Soviet apartment blocks to basements, to bathrooms in active buildings where landlords had given up caring what tenants did. The smell of chemicals announced these operations to anyone nearby, a distinctive combination of gasoline, iodine, and burnt matches that neighbours learned to associate with drug activity. Some cooks developed reputations for making stronger or safer batches. These individuals wielded unusual power in addict communities, controlling access to the drug through their knowledge and willingness to cook. Others experimented with recipe modifications, trying different solvents or acid concentrations, occasionally discovering methods that were slightly less toxic, but usually just creating new variations of the same poison. The recipe evolved through trial and error, with successful innovations spreading through word of mouth, and unsuccessful ones removing their inventors from the gene pool. The irony was suffocating. Soviet education had been excellent, particularly in technical and scientific fields. Many Krokodil users had attended decent schools, learned chemistry and mathematics, understood scientific principles. They were applying genuine chemical knowledge to create a substance that would destroy them. In a different country with different circumstances, these same people might have become legitimate chemists or engineers. Instead, they used their education to synthesize flesh-eating drugs in kitchens using gasoline. Pharmacies eventually noticed suspicious buying patterns, young men purchasing maximum quantities of codeine pills, returning daily for more, buying iodine in bulk, asking for specific formulations. Some pharmacists refused sales, others reported suspicious customers to police, most simply sold the products because it wasn't illegal and they needed the business. A few pharmacies in particularly affected areas stopped carrying codeine entirely, which only pushed users to travel farther or bribe pharmacy workers for under-the-counter sales. The government's response to this pharmacy issue created its own absurd situation. Rather than addressing why people were so desperate for opiates that they'd cook gasoline mixtures, authorities focused on restricting codeine access. This made the problem worse for several years because it drove up codeine prices without providing any alternative treatment, forcing users to either pay more or seek other solutions. Some switched to even more dangerous recipes using different precursors. Others adulterated their Krokodil with additional substances to stretch supplies, adding new toxins to an already poisonous mixture. The cooking process released fumes that damaged lungs and exposed cooks to chemical burns. Red phosphorus is highly reactive and can ignite spontaneously if heated incorrectly, causing fires in cooking locations. Several documented cases involved explosions or fires that killed cooks and destroyed buildings, adding home laboratory accidents to Krokodil's growing list of ways it could kill you. Users accepted these risks as part of the process, another cost of doing business when your business is staying ahead of withdrawal. What users didn't fully grasp was the cumulative nature of the damage. Each injection added to the toxic load, building toward a threshold that, once crossed, triggered catastrophic tissue failure. The poisons didn't wash out between doses, they accumulated. Phosphorus integrated into bone structure. Gasoline residues remained in fatty tissues. Iodine damaged thyroid function. The acid scarred blood vessel walls. With every injection, the body moved closer to systemic breakdown, all while the user felt nothing except relief from withdrawal and a brief, intense high. The ease of production was the trap. If Krokodil required complex chemistry or expensive equipment, fewer people would attempt it. If the recipe demanded rare ingredients, supply limitations would restrict use. Instead, everything needed was readily available. The process was simple enough for desperate people to master, and the result was immediately rewarding. The drug's accessibility was precisely what made it a perfect killing machine, removing every barrier between addiction and self-destruction. Somewhere in Russia right now, someone is crushing codeine pills and reaching for a matchbox. The recipe continues circulating, passed from user to user, carrying its poisonous knowledge forward. Each new person who learns to cook Krokodil gains the power to destroy themselves with remarkable efficiency, all for the price of a few dollars and 45 minutes in a kitchen. The chemistry is simple, the consequences are not. The first injection feels like victory. Relief floods through the body as withdrawal symptoms vanish, replaced by warm euphoria that makes everything temporarily bearable. Pain dissolves, anxiety evaporates, and for 90 precious minutes the world becomes soft around the edges. Users describe this initial high as cleaner than heroin, hitting harder and faster, justifying every risk they took to create it. The injection site might burn slightly, a minor discomfort attributed to poor injection technique or hitting a nerve. Nothing suggests that the countdown to catastrophic tissue failure has already begun. Hour 1 passes in chemical bliss. The desomorphine binds to opiate receptors throughout the brain and body, producing effects identical to any powerful opiate. Breathing slows, pupils constrict to pinpoints, heartbeat becomes distant and dreamlike. Meanwhile, the toxic soup of chemicals begins its real work beneath the skin. Gasoline molecules diffuse into surrounding tissue. Iodine compounds start breaking down cellular structures, and phosphorus particles lodge in blood vessel walls. The damage operates silently, invisible, gathering momentum. By hour 6, the injection site starts looking wrong. A dark red patch appears around where the needle entered, spreading outward in an irregular circle. The skin feels tight, almost hard to the touch. Users recognize this pattern from previous injections and dismiss it as normal track mark development, no different than the bruising heroin leaves behind. They inject again in a different location, perhaps the other arm or a leg vein, adding fresh chemicals to the growing disaster unfolding beneath their skin. Day 1 ends with subtle warning signs most users ignore. The injection site has darkened to deep purple or black, the discoloration spreading several centimeters in all directions. The area feels warm, indicating inflammation, as the immune system desperately attempts damage control. A faint smell emerges, something slightly off like meat left out too long. Heroin users never experience anything like this, but Krokodil users convince themselves it's temporary, that their bodies just need time to adjust. Day 3 brings pain that over-the-counter painkillers can't touch. The injection site has progressed beyond bruising into something fundamentally different. The skin appears waxy, taking on a greenish-grey tint that looks disturbingly reptilian. When pressed, it doesn't spring back like healthy tissue. The texture resembles leather more than skin, thick and inflexible. The smell intensifies, becoming impossible to mask with soap or cologne. Other people notice and move away instinctively, recognizing the odor of decay even if they can't identify its source. Week 1 marks the point of no return, though most users don't realize it yet. The affected area has expanded to cover an entire section of limb, the skin developing scales and cracks that weep clear fluid mixed with blood. The medical term is necrosis, tissue death, but that clinical description fails to capture the visceral reality. Cells dying by the millions, their contents spilling into surrounding areas and triggering more death. Blood vessels that carried gasoline and acids have collapsed or ruptured, cutting off oxygen supply to downstream tissue. Without oxygen, more cells die. The cycle accelerates. Beneath the deteriorating skin, muscle tissue begins breaking down. The chemicals injected don't discriminate between blood vessels and muscle fibers. They destroy everything they contact. Muscle proteins denature and liquefy, transforming from functional tissue into a putrid slurry. This liquid has nowhere to go, accumulating in pockets that press against skin from the inside. Users notice their limbs swelling, becoming grotesquely enlarged around injection sites. The swelling indicates massive internal damage, entire sections of muscle converting into dead tissue faster than the body can remove it. Week 2 introduces infections. Bacteria thrive in dead tissue, finding an ideal environment with no blood flow to deliver immune cells or antibiotics. Staphylococcus, streptococcus, and anaerobic bacteria colonize the dying areas, releasing toxins and digestive enzymes that accelerate tissue breakdown. The smell becomes overwhelming, a thick, sweet, rotten odour that clings to clothes and fills rooms. Fever develops as the immune system attempts to fight an unwinnable battle against both bacterial invasion and chemical poisoning. Body temperature spikes to 39 or 40 degrees Celsius, leaving users sweating and shaking. The skin finally ruptures during week 3 or 4. What had been swollen and discoloured suddenly opens, either from mechanical stress or because the tissue has rotted through completely. The opening reveals what lies beneath: liquefied muscle, exposed tendons, and in severe cases, bone. The wound doesn't bleed much because blood vessels in the area are already destroyed. Instead, a thick greyish-brown fluid drains out, carrying dead tissue and bacterial colonies. The sight and smell are so horrific that even hardened addicts feel nauseated looking at their own bodies. Bone infections establish themselves once tissue destruction reaches that depth. Osteomyelitis, the medical term for bone infection, is notoriously difficult to treat even with proper antibiotics and surgical care. The infection works its way into bone marrow, killing cells that produce blood and immune components. Bones become brittle and prone to fracturing. The pain is extraordinary, a deep aching throb that never stops and responds poorly to any medication. Users who started injecting Krokodil to escape pain now experience pain worse than anything they'd known before. Gangrene spreads along the limb as blood supply fails progressively. Wet gangrene, involving bacterial infection, produces the horrific smell and rapid tissue breakdown. Dry gangrene, where tissue simply dies without infection, turns affected areas black and mummified. Both types can coexist on the same limb, creating a patchwork of different stages of death. The body attempts to wall off the damage through inflammation, but the continuing injections ensure that fresh toxins keep arriving, extending the zone of destruction. Month 1 typically brings the first amputation, or the decision to continue injecting despite visible bones. Users face an impossible choice: stop using and suffer through excruciating withdrawal while their body tries to fight massive infections, or keep injecting in different locations to stay ahead of the sickness. Most choose continued use because withdrawal on top of infection and pain seems unbearable. They rotate injection sites, moving from ruined veins to fresh ones, buying time measured in days or weeks. The progression varies by injection location. Arms and legs show damage fastest because they have less blood flow cushion than central body areas. Hands and feet, already far from the heart, develop necrosis especially quickly. Some users inject into the groin near the femoral vein, causing infections that spread into the pelvic region or down the leg. Others use jugular neck veins, risking brain infections and strokes. Desperate users inject into any accessible vein, creating multiple sites of active tissue destruction simultaneously. Medical documentation from Russian hospitals reveals the typical trajectory. Patients arrive unconscious or delirious with fever, their limbs already displaying advanced necrosis. Blood tests show massive infections, kidney failure from toxic overload, liver damage from processing poisons, and blood chemistry so deranged that survival seems unlikely. Surgeons evaluate the damage and deliver devastating news. Amputation is the only option, and even that might not save them. The infections have spread systemically, meaning bacteria are circulating through the bloodstream, establishing colonies in lungs, heart valves, kidneys. Amputations proceed without adequate anesthesia in many cases. Russian hospitals, particularly in rural areas, lack resources for complex surgeries on drug users who are considered low-priority patients. Surgeons remove limbs in emergency procedures, cutting away all visibly dead tissue and hoping they've reached healthy areas before the infection spread too far. The amputation stumps often fail to heal properly because the patient's entire system is compromised. New infections develop at surgical sites. Some patients require multiple amputations, losing first a hand, then a forearm, then an entire arm as necrosis advances despite surgical interventions. The truly cruel aspect is that amputation doesn't cure addiction. Users who survive wake up missing limbs, still physically dependent on opiates, still facing withdrawal if they don't continue using. Some attempt to inject into remaining veins using prosthetics or asking others for help. Many die from post-surgical infections or complications. A few achieve sobriety, haunted by missing limbs and memories of watching their own bodies decompose. The survival stories are rare enough to make the news. The deaths are too common to count accurately. Average lifespan after first Krokodil use ranges from 1 to 2 years, with many users dying within months. The causes of death vary: overwhelming sepsis, organ failure, hemorrhage from ruptured vessels, heart valve infections, stroke, respiratory failure, or simply the cumulative effect of injecting gasoline dozens of times daily. Some die in hospitals during attempted treatment. Others die in apartments or abandoned buildings, their bodies discovered days later in advanced decomposition that makes it difficult to determine how long they'd been dead. The high only lasts 90 minutes. Users inject 4 to 6 times daily, each injection accelerating their destruction, depositing more poison, creating new sites of tissue death. The mathematics of Krokodil use are straightforward: inject regularly and die within 2 years, stop injecting and face withdrawal, plus massive infections with poor treatment prospects, or somehow access real addiction treatment which barely exists in Russia. No good options present themselves, so users choose the option that delays immediate suffering, even as their bodies literally fall apart. Immune systems collapse under the combined assault of repeated chemical poisoning, chronic bacterial infections, malnutrition, and the immunosuppressive effects of opiates. White blood cell counts drop as bone marrow fails. Users become susceptible to opportunistic infections, pneumonia, tuberculosis, fungal infections, that healthy immune systems could easily fight. Many die from diseases unrelated to Krokodil's direct effects, simply because their bodies lack any defensive capability. The horror is watching it happen to yourself. Unlike diseases that progress invisibly inside the body, Krokodil's destruction is external and visible. Users see their skin turn green and scaly, watch ulcers open and expand, smell their own rotting flesh, feel bones grinding where muscle used to cushion them. They remain conscious and aware throughout, experiencing every stage of their decomposition in real time. The psychological trauma of witnessing your own body consuming itself adds a dimension to the suffering that goes beyond physical pain. Yet they continue injecting. Addiction overrides self-preservation instincts that evolution spent millions of years perfecting. The brain's reward system, hijacked by opiates, screams that the next injection is more important than anything, including life itself. Users understand they're dying, accept this as inevitable, and inject anyway because the alternative is experiencing that death while suffering withdrawal. The logic is airtight within addiction's framework. If you're dying either way, you might as well die comfortable. Krokodil doesn't just kill. It rots you alive slowly enough that you watch the entire process. That's the distinction between this and other dangerous drugs. Fentanyl kills through overdose, quickly And unconsciously, alcohol destroys the liver over decades. Methamphetamine ravages mental health before physical. Krokodil shows you your bones within weeks while keeping you conscious enough to register the horror. The body becomes enemy territory, each day bringing fresh evidence of irreversible decay that no amount of medical care can fully reverse. By 2006, Krokodil had escaped its initial outbreak zones and begun spreading across Russia like a plague following railway lines and highway routes. The drug moved from user to user, city to city, carried by people who shared the recipe as casually as someone might share a cooking technique for bread. Siberia became ground zero for the epidemic, those vast frozen regions where winter lasts 8 months, and economic opportunities disappeared with the Soviet Union. Cities like Omsk, Novosibirsk, and Irkutsk saw Krokodil use explode as heroin supplies dwindled and codeine remained cheaply available. The geographic pattern revealed brutal economic realities. Urban centres with functioning economies and heroin access saw less Krokodil use. Rural areas, industrial towns that collapsed after Soviet factory closures, and isolated communities experienced epidemic-level adoption. Unemployment in these regions exceeded 30%, sometimes reaching 40 or 50% among young men. Jobs that existed paid subsistence wages insufficient for heroin but adequate for codeine and matchboxes. The drug filled a specific ecological niche. Places desperate enough to inject gasoline but not connected enough to access better alternatives. Tver, a city 180 kilometers northwest of Moscow, documented some of the earliest concentrated outbreaks. Local hospitals began seeing patients with necrotic limbs in late 2005, initially misdiagnosing them as severe bacterial infections from contaminated heroin. The numbers increased throughout 2006 and 2007. Overwhelming medical staff who had no experience treating gasoline poisoning delivered directly into veins. Doctors watched patients die despite aggressive antibiotic treatment and multiple surgeries, unable to understand why infections progress so unusually fast. Nizhny Novgorod, Russia's 5th largest city, saw its Krokodil crisis emerge slightly later, but more intensely. The city had established heroin distribution networks that collapsed during the government crackdown, leaving thousands of addicts without access to their drug. Codeine pills remained available in the city's numerous pharmacies, and the Krokodil recipe arrived via addicts who'd learned it in other regions. By 2008, the city's addiction treatment facilities, already understaffed and underfunded, were reporting that nearly 30% of admissions involved Krokodil-related complications. Ekaterinburg became infamous for its Krokodil mortality rates. The Ural mountain city, positioned between European Russia and Siberia, served as a crossroads for drug trafficking and a barometer for trends affecting both regions. Hospital number 3 in Ekaterinburg performed dozens of emergency amputations monthly by 2009. Its surgical wards filled with young people missing limbs, many of whom died from infections before recovering from surgery. The hospital's morgue operated beyond capacity, bodies of Krokodil victims requiring rapid processing because decomposition continued aggressively after death. The demographics told their own story. Men aged 18 to 35 formed roughly 70% of users, but the remaining 30% included women, teenagers as young as 15, and older addicts who'd switched from heroin when supplies dried up. Women faced particular horror because breast tissue and subcutaneous fat provided additional areas where toxic chemicals could accumulate. Female users injecting into arm or leg veins experienced the same necrosis as men, plus systemic toxicity that often prevented pregnancy or caused miscarriages in those who managed to conceive. Teenagers represented the most tragic demographic. Many had never used heroin, starting directly with Krokodil because it was available and cheap. Their developing bodies suffered accelerated damage, immune systems less equipped to fight the infections, bones still growing even as they became riddled with toxic compounds. Schools in affected areas watched students disappear, reappearing months later missing fingers or hands, sometimes not reappearing at all. Teachers and administrators received no guidance on addressing the crisis, no resources for prevention, just mounting losses. Social structures formed around crocodile use, creating communities bound by shared destruction. Groups of 3 to 5 users would establish regular cooking and injection sessions, meeting in abandoned Soviet-era buildings that dotted every Russian city. These structures, left to decay after the Union's collapse, provided shelter from weather and privacy from authorities. Users brought ingredients. Someone with relatively steady hands cooked the batch, and everyone shared the product according to complex hierarchies based on who contributed what. The cooking locations became known territories. Certain abandoned apartment buildings in Tver housed semi-permanent crocodile communities, dozens of users rotating through over the course of days. Basements in Nizhny Novgorod served similar purposes, their walls stained with chemical residues and littered with used syringes, empty codeine packaging and discarded matchbooks. Police knew about these locations but lacked resources or motivation to shut them all down, instead conducting occasional raids that scattered users temporarily before they reconvened elsewhere. Needle sharing reached epidemic proportions within these communities. Clean needles were expensive and difficult to obtain, while Crocodile's short duration meant users needed to inject multiple times daily. A single syringe might pass through 5 or 6 people during one session, cleaned only by rinsing with water if cleaned at all. HIV and hepatitis C transmission rates in crocodile-using populations approached 60 to 70%, adding viral infections to the toxic chemical load users' bodies struggle to handle. Advanced users with severely damaged arms and legs required assistance injecting into remaining viable veins. The grotesque intimacy of these sessions involved one person holding another's limb steady while finding a vein that hadn't collapsed, threading a needle into vessels that kept disappearing beneath scar tissue and necrotic zones. Users injected each other into neck veins, femoral veins in the groin, subclavian veins beneath the collarbone, anywhere blood still flowed. The progression mapped the body's slow surrender to chemicals, each new injection site marking another territory lost. Russian authorities systematically suppressed information about the epidemic during its early years. The government, sensitive to international criticism about drug problems and determined to project strength, discouraged media coverage of the crisis. Journalists who attempted stories about Krokodil faced pressure from officials claiming such reports damaged Russia's reputation. State-controlled media outlets ignored the issue entirely, while independent journalists lacked access to affected regions or resources to conduct thorough investigations. The suppression extended to medical documentation. Doctors treating crocodile patients received informal instructions to avoid mentioning the drug in official reports, instead coding cases as severe bacterial infections or complications from intravenous drug use. The Ministry of Health published no statistics on crocodile use, conducted no official studies, and provided no guidance to medical professionals encountering the crisis. This information blackout meant even Russian doctors in unaffected regions had no idea what their colleagues elsewhere were battling. Western journalists had little presence in Siberian cities or Russian industrial towns. Foreign correspondents concentrated in Moscow and St. Petersburg, covering politics and high-profile stories, not the struggles of addicts in remote areas. The few who heard rumours about a flesh-eating drug dismissed them as exaggerated, or considered them insufficiently important to investigate. Russia's drug problems seemed like internal affairs that wouldn't interest international audiences. The language barrier compounded the issue. Most reporting about Krokodil existed only in Russian, posted on forums and medical websites that Western media never monitored. The first credible warnings emerged from Russian doctors posting on medical forums and websites during 2009-2010. Physicians in Ekaterinburg, Omsk, and other affected cities began sharing case photos and treatment notes, seeking advice from colleagues about the unprecedented injuries they were seeing. Images appeared showing limbs with exposed bone, skulls visible through facial tissue, amputations that failed to heal. These posts circulated within Russian medical communities, generating alarm among healthcare professionals who recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Western medical professionals eventually encountered these forum posts, but many dismissed them as fabrications or extremely rare cases being sensationalized. The photos seemed too horrific to be real, more like special effects from horror movies than actual medical documentation. Some speculated the images showed chemical burns or rare bacterial infections unrelated to drug use. The idea that people were voluntarily injecting gasoline-based mixtures seemed so absurd that even medical professionals struggled to accept it as reality. By 2011, the epidemic could no longer be hidden. Russia officially reported 2.5 million registered heroin addicts, with actual numbers certainly higher, given that most addicts avoid registration. Estimates of Krokodil use varied wildly. Some suggested 100,000 people had tried it, others claimed several 100,000. The disparity reflected the lack of systematic data collection and the underground nature of use. What was undeniable was that hundreds of thousands of Russians had at least experimented with Krokodil, and tens of thousands were regular users facing imminent death. The epidemic had burned through entire cohorts of young men in specific regions. Some rural towns lost 5 to 10% of their male population aged 20 to 35 within a few years, deaths attributed to infections, overdoses, or simply listed as complications from chronic illness. Families buried sons and daughters, often without understanding exactly what had killed them, because shame and stigma prevented open discussion. Communities struggled to process losses on a scale usually associated with wars or natural disasters, except these casualties happened slowly, painfully, one rotting limb at a time. Pharmacies finally faced consequences for unlimited codeine sales. The Russian government, responding to mounting evidence of the crisis, began implementing restrictions on over-the-counter codeine during 2011-2012. But the regulations rolled out slowly, unevenly, with regional variations that created opportunities for users to travel to areas with lax enforcement. Some pharmacies ignored the new rules entirely, continuing to sell codeine to anyone who asked, because the profit margin was too valuable to sacrifice. The black market for codeine expanded, with pills stolen from warehouses or smuggled from neighbouring countries where regulations remained loose. The death toll climbed while authorities debated responses. Every month brought hundreds of new deaths, thousands of new infections, and fresh cohorts of users discovering that Krokodil seemed like a solution, until your skin started turning green. The epidemic had momentum, a self-sustaining pattern of desperate people teaching other desperate people how to destroy themselves efficiently. In cities across Russia, groups huddled in basements and abandoned buildings, crushing pills and mixing gasoline, preparing the next injection that would bring 90 minutes of relief and accelerate their decay by another increment. The pattern repeated across time zones and climate zones, from Kaliningrad near Poland to Vladivostok on the Pacific coast. Wherever heroin dried up and codeine remained available, Krokodil filled the gap. The drug respected no boundaries of culture or geography within Russia's borders, affecting ethnic Russians, Tatars, Ukrainians, indigenous Siberian populations. The only requirement was desperation, addiction, and access to a recipe that anyone could follow with ingredients anyone could obtain. International isolation worked in the epidemic's favour. If Krokodil had emerged in Western Europe or North America, the alarm would have sounded immediately, triggering public health responses and media coverage. But emerging in Russia's forgotten regions, affecting populations already marginalised and dismissed, the drug spread for years before the world noticed. By the time Western awareness began crystallising in 2011-2012, Krokodil had already killed thousands and maimed tens of thousands more. The delayed response meant the epidemic grew unchecked during its most crucial early phase, establishing patterns and supply chains that would persist even after authorities finally acknowledged the problem. Somewhere in Siberia, in a freezing apartment building with broken windows, another group was mixing their evening batch. The gasoline smell mingled with the cold air. Someone's hands shook as they tried to draw the liquid into a syringe, and outside the authorities were finally beginning to realise that something unprecedented was destroying their citizens. Too late for the person about to inject, too late for thousands already dead, barely in time for those who might still be saved if anyone could figure out how to save people determined to destroy themselves. The photographs that went viral in 2011 weren't staged horror movie stills or medical anomalies from rare diseases. They documented living human beings who'd injected Krokodil and were now experiencing the consequences in high-resolution colour. The images circulated first on Russian medical forums, then spread to international sites as doctors sought second opinions from colleagues abroad. One photograph showed a man whose lower jaw had rotted away completely, exposing his tongue and the interior structures of his mouth to open air. His eyes stared directly at the camera, conscious and aware, fully cognizant that his face was dissolving. Another widely shared image captured a woman in her mid-20s whose entire thigh had become a crater of exposed bone. The femur gleamed white amidst dead tissue, the leg's circumference reduced by half where muscle had liquefied and drained. She was lying in a hospital bed, alive, her face visible in the frame showing an expression somewhere between exhaustion and resignation. The photograph's clinical lighting and hospital setting made the horror more real, stripping away any possibility that this was dramatized or exaggerated. A third image showed a user whose skull was partially visible through dissolved facial tissue on one side of his head. The bone structure around his temple and cheek had lost its covering, creating an anatomy lesson in the worst possible way. The intact side of his face appeared normal, young even, making the destroyed side more shocking through contrast. He'd survived long enough for someone to photograph the damage, meaning he'd endured days or weeks watching his face decompose in mirrors. These weren't the worst cases, just the ones documented thoroughly enough to share. Hospital wards across Russia contained patients in similar or worse condition. Their situations too urgent for photography, or too disturbing for even hardened medical professionals to want documented. The viral images represented a tiny fraction of Krokodil's victims, selected not for their severity, but simply because someone had taken pictures, and those pictures had escaped into the wider world. Yekaterinburg Hospital No. 3 became notorious as the epicenter for Krokodil treatment attempts. The facility handled addiction-related complications across the Ural region, giving its staff exposure to more Krokodil cases than perhaps anywhere else in Russia. Surgeons there performed amputations daily throughout 2010-2011, their operating rooms processing a conveyor belt of destroyed limbs. The hospital kept limited records due to bureaucratic pressure to downplay the crisis, but medical staff shared information informally through conferences and publications. Dr. Maxim Krupitsky, working at addiction treatment facilities in St. Petersburg and surveying the national situation, provided some of the most detailed professional testimony about Krokodil's effects. His documentation described operating on 23-year-old patients whose bodies resembled 80-year-old corpses, tissues so degraded that standard surgical techniques failed. Young people arrived with advanced osteoporosis, their bones brittle and porous from phosphorus poisoning. Immune function in chronic users had collapsed to levels seen in late-stage AIDS patients, leaving them defenseless against opportunistic infections. The typical trajectory reconstructed from hospital admission records followed a predictable nightmare pattern. Users started with heroin, became addicted, lost access when supplies dried up or prices exceeded their means. Someone introduced them to Krokodil as a cheaper alternative, emphasizing the easy synthesis and powerful high. First injection seemed successful, providing the relief they needed without obvious immediate consequences. They continued using, injecting multiple times daily, convinced they could manage the risks better than other users whose horror stories circulated through drug communities. Within 2 weeks, the injection sites looked distinctly wrong, displaying discoloration and texture changes that clearly weren't normal track marks. Users hid the damage under long sleeves or pants, avoided medical attention, and continued injecting in different locations. The denial phase lasted until the smell became impossible to ignore or the pain exceeded their ability to function. By the time they sought help, typically 4 to 8 weeks after starting Krokodil, the damage had advanced to stages requiring immediate amputation or complex reconstructive surgeries that barely existed in Russian healthcare. Hospital arrivals came in several forms. Some walked in voluntarily, finally acknowledging they needed help, their infected limbs wrapped in makeshift bandages that did nothing to contain the smell or stop the progression. Others arrived unconscious, brought by family members or found by police during raids on drug houses. The unconscious patients often had better outcomes because they couldn't resist treatment, while conscious users frequently left hospitals against medical advice, driven by withdrawal and addiction to return to the streets and inject again. Family dynamics around Krokodil users created their own tragedies. Parents who'd struggled with their children's heroin addiction found Krokodil far worse, the visible physical destruction making denial impossible. Mothers watched sons' bodies fall apart in real time, unable to force them into treatment, helpless as the disease advanced daily. Some families disowned users not primarily from moral judgment, but because the physical horror became unbearable, the smell pervading homes, the sight of rotting flesh appearing at dinner tables, the knowledge that their child was essentially a walking corpse. Siblings and friends maintained distance for similar reasons. The transformation from recognizable human to grotesquely disfigured invalid happened fast enough that people couldn't process it emotionally. Someone who looked normal 3 months ago now appeared in public with exposed bones, missing limbs, faces partially destroyed. The cognitive dissonance was too great. Many users found themselves completely isolated, surrounded only by other Krokodil users who understood because they faced identical deterioration. The social isolation intensified addiction's grip. Users with nothing left, no family support, no employment, no housing except abandoned buildings, no future except certain death, had no reason to stop using. Sobriety meant facing the ruins of their lives and bodies while enduring excruciating withdrawal. Continued use meant 90-minute periods of relief punctuated by preparations for the next injection. The choice was obvious to anyone trapped in that situation, even though it guaranteed death. What stunned medical professionals was how many users continued injecting even after amputations. Patients who'd lost a hand or forearm would be back in emergency rooms weeks later, with infections in the remaining arm. Those who'd lost both arms sometimes convinced others to inject them, or learned to inject into leg veins using their feet or mouths to manipulate syringes. The addiction overpowered every survival instinct, every lesson learned, every horror witnessed. The phenomenon of rotating injection sites created bodies covered in zones of destruction at different stages. A user might have a 6-month-old scar on the right arm where tissue had died but eventually healed, a fresh infection on the left arm from last week's injections, and actively rotting tissue on the left leg from this morning's dose. The body became a map of their addiction, each damaged area marking a period of use, the progression of sites showing the drug's systematic conquest of their entire physical form. Groin injections produced particularly horrific complications. The femoral vein's proximity to lymph nodes and sexual organs meant infection spread rapidly into critical systems. Men developed necrosis of penile tissue and testicles, requiring genital amputations that destroyed any possibility of normal life, even if they somehow achieved sobriety. Women face similar destruction of vaginal tissue and labia. These complications rarely appeared in medical literature because patients died too quickly, or the shame prevented discussion even in clinical contexts. Neck injections into the jugular vein carried risks of stroke and brain infection. Users who'd exhausted all limb veins turned to neck veins as a last resort, fully aware this was essentially suicide but unable to face withdrawal. The toxic chemicals entering the jugular flowed directly to the brain within seconds, causing immediate neurological effects ranging from seizures to hemorrhagic strokes. Many users injecting into neck veins collapsed immediately, dying before they could pull out the needle. Statistical documentation remained incomplete, but evidence suggested thousands of deaths and tens of thousands of permanent disabilities directly attributable to Krokodil between 2006 and 2014. Mortality occurred through multiple mechanisms: overwhelming sepsis as infection spread systemically, organ failure from accumulated toxins, hemorrhage from ruptured blood vessels, heart valve infections, pneumonia in immunocompromised patients, and stroke. Many deaths went unrecorded or misattributed, listed simply as drug overdoses or infection complications without mentioning Krokodil specifically. The disability statistics were even grimmer. For every user who died, several survived with amputated limbs, permanent immune system damage, chronic infections requiring lifelong treatment, and psychological trauma from watching their bodies decompose. These survivors, typically in their 20s and 30s, faced decades of life with severe disabilities, no job prospects, minimal government support, and ongoing struggles with addiction, since amputation didn't cure physical dependence on opiates. Medical costs per patient easily exceeded anything the Russian healthcare system could reasonably provide. Emergency amputation surgery cost thousands of dollars. Post-operative care, including antibiotics, wound management, and rehabilitation cost thousands more. Patients required multiple surgeries as infections spread or amputations proved insufficient. Most received substandard care because resources didn't exist for complex treatment of patients whose prognosis remained poor regardless of intervention. The grim calculus facing Russian doctors was choosing which patients to treat aggressively and which to provide comfort care. A 22-year-old with one infected arm might receive full treatment including surgery and proper antibiotics. The same person returning 6 months later with 3 infected limbs and systemic sepsis might receive only pain management because the resources required to save them exceeded what the hospital could allocate. Triage decisions usually reserved for mass casualty events became routine in hospitals treating Krokodil patients. Doctors and nurses developed psychological trauma from treating Krokodil cases. The smell of rotting flesh persisted in their nostrils even at home, appearing in nightmares, triggering nausea during meals. The futility of treatment wore down medical professionals who entered healthcare to help people, only to watch young patients die despite their best efforts. Some transferred to different specialties, unable to continue treating drug-related complications. Others hardened emotionally, developing cynicism and detachment as defense mechanisms against the horror they witnessed daily. The few successful recovery stories barely existed. Patients who survived amputation, achieved sobriety, and managed to rebuild lives could be counted in handfuls relative to the thousands who died. These survivors carried visible reminders of their addiction, missing limbs, severe scarring, damaged immune systems that prevented them from fully reintegrating into society. They found communities of other survivors, sharing experiences that no one else could understand, bound by the trauma of having injected gasoline and lived to remember it. The photographs that went viral represented real people, not statistics or abstractions. Each destroyed limb belonged to someone with a name, a history, and reasons for their choices, even if those reasons seem incomprehensible from outside. The man without a jaw had been someone's son. The woman with the exposed femur had perhaps been someone's daughter or mother. The user with the visible skull had lived a life before Krokodil, had experienced happiness and normalcy, had not imagined ending up as a medical curiosity photographed for international shock value. Their images circulated globally, viewed millions of times, generating clicks and advertising revenue for websites that hosted them. Few viewers considered whether displaying these photographs without consent violated the subject's dignity, or whether the sensational coverage actually helped anyone. The images became currency in the attention economy, proof that Russia was somehow failing its people, evidence that drug addiction could produce outcomes worse than death. The real humans in those photographs became props in other people's narratives, their suffering commodified and consumed then forgotten as the internet moved on to the next horror. But the people were real, and they suffered, and many died after those photographs were taken. Their bodies were disposed of, often in unmarked graves or cremated because families couldn't afford proper funerals. The images remained online forever, permanent documentation of what happens when society fails to address addiction until people are literally rotting alive. Those photographs are still searchable today, still shocking new viewers, still generating revenue for websites, while the people they depict are long dead and largely forgotten, except as cautionary tales about the dangers of drug use in Russia. The Russian government finally acknowledged the Krokodil crisis in 2012, 5 years after the epidemic had established itself across the country's most vulnerable regions. The response was characteristically Russian, aggressive, punitive, and completely divorced from medical reality. On June 1, 2012, new regulations took effect reclassifying codeine-containing medications as prescription only, ending decades of over-the-counter availability. Politicians declared victory over the flesh-eating drug before the ink dried on the legislation, convinced that removing codeine access would solve the problem as cleanly as flipping a light switch. The ban immediately created shortages for legitimate patients who'd used codeine for pain management and cough suppression. Pharmacies stopped stocking the medications entirely, rather than deal with prescription requirements and regulatory scrutiny. Elderly Russians with chronic pain conditions found themselves unable to obtain relief they'd relied on for years. Cancer patients requiring mild opiates for breakthrough pain faced bureaucratic obstacles to get prescriptions. The government had eliminated legal access without considering who actually needed these medications for legitimate purposes. Krokodil users adapted within weeks. Black markets for codeine exploded across Russia as demand collided with restricted supply. Pills that once cost 30 to 50 rubles now sold for 200 to 300 rubles on the street, still cheaper than heroin, but no longer the bargain that had driven initial adoption. Organised crime groups recognised the opportunity and began smuggling codeine from neighbouring countries with looser regulations. Kazakhstan, Belarus and Ukraine became source countries for Russian codeine black markets, their pharmacies suddenly seeing unusual demand from Russian buyers. Some users switched to alternative synthesis methods that didn't require codeine. Underground chemists experimented with other opiate precursors, creating variations of Krokodil with different toxic profiles but similar flesh-eating properties. The fundamental problem remained unchanged. Desperate addicts with chemistry knowledge and access to poisonous solvents would create something, and that something would inevitably be dangerous. Banning codeine simply shifted the recipe, rather than eliminating the demand driving people to inject gasoline. Pharmacy employees became black market suppliers, stealing inventory or selling under the table for premium prices. The prescription requirement created opportunities for corruption that employees struggling on low wages couldn't resist. A box of codeine pills that would normally net the pharmacy 500 rubles in legitimate sales could fetch 5,000 rubles from dealers. Some pharmacies operated essentially as fronts, maintaining minimal legitimate business while conducting most transactions through back doors. Police raids occasionally shut down these operations, but new suppliers emerged immediately to fill the vacuum. The enforcement response treated Krokodil users as criminals first and medical patients never. Police conducted aggressive raids on known drug houses, arresting everyone present regardless of their medical condition or need for emergency treatment. Users with active infections and exposed bones found themselves in jail cells without medical care, their conditions deteriorating rapidly. Some died in custody from sepsis or complications while awaiting processing. The police considered these deaths unfortunate but acceptable casualties in the war on drugs. Criminal penalties for drug possession in Russia were severe, with even small amounts triggering prison sentences. Krokodil users caught with homemade desomorphine faced years in prison camps, their infected limbs receiving minimal treatment in facilities lacking basic medical resources. The prison system had no capacity to handle inmates requiring complex wound care, antibiotic therapy, or addiction treatment. Many prisoners died from infections that proper hospitals could have managed, their deaths officially recorded as natural causes to avoid scrutiny. The treatment infrastructure that might have saved lives simply didn't exist at scale. Russia had fewer than 350 specialized drug rehabilitation centers serving a population of 140 million people with an estimated 2.5 million opiate addicts. The mathematics were brutal. Even if every center operated at full capacity treating only opiate addicts, they could serve perhaps 50,000 people annually while millions needed help. The waitlist for treatment stretched months or years, guaranteeing that most users would die before accessing care. The treatment methods employed in existing centers relied on outdated Soviet-era approaches. Cold turkey detoxification without medication assistance remained standard, based on the philosophy that addicts needed to suffer through withdrawal to truly commit to sobriety. This approach had failure rates exceeding 90% because it ignored the physiological reality of opiate dependence. Patients who somehow survived the excruciating withdrawal process typically relapsed within days or weeks of release, returning immediately to drug use because the underlying addiction hadn't been addressed. Methadone maintenance therapy, proven effective in Western countries for managing opiate addiction, remained completely illegal in Russia. The government viewed methadone as simply substituting one addiction for another, refusing to acknowledge the difference between controlled pharmaceutical opiates and street drugs cut with gasoline. Suboxone and other modern addiction medications face similar bans or severe restrictions. Russian addiction treatment philosophy demanded complete abstinence immediately, a standard that virtually no one could meet, especially when facing the physical complications of Krokodil use. The cultural stigma surrounding addiction made treatment seeking nearly impossible even when services existed. Russian society viewed drug addicts as moral failures, criminals and parasites rather than patients with a medical condition. Families who sought help for addicted relatives faced social ostracism from neighbours and communities. Employers immediately terminated workers discovered to have addiction issues. The shame attached to admission of drug problems was so intense that many users preferred death to seeking help, knowing that help would come with judgment, rejection, and possibly criminal prosecution. Hospitals treating Krokodil complications operated under impossible constraints. Emergency rooms in affected cities saw dozens of cases weekly, but lacked resources for proper treatment. Surgeons performed amputations without adequate anesthesia because supplies ran short and drug users ranked lowest priority for medication. Operating rooms meant for general surgery were commandeered for endless amputations, delaying other necessary procedures. The specialized equipment and expertise needed for treating severe infections barely existed outside major urban centers. The cost-benefit analysis from the healthcare system's perspective was devastating. Treating one Krokodil patient through emergency amputation, post-operative care, antibiotics, wound management and rehabilitation could easily cost 500,000 to 1 million rubles or more. That same money might provide routine care for hundreds of non-drug using patients. With budgets already stretched impossibly thin, hospitals made calculated decisions to provide minimal care to Krokodil patients, acknowledging that most would die regardless of intervention. Patients frequently receive surgeries without proper follow-up care. A user might have an infected arm amputated, then be discharged days later with minimal instructions and no support for managing their recovery or addiction. The surgical sites became infected, requiring readmission and additional surgery that the hospital couldn't afford. The cycle repeated until the patient died or stopped seeking treatment entirely. The healthcare system was performing expensive interventions that failed because they couldn't provide the comprehensive care needed for success. Harm reduction programs that might have prevented some damage, needle exchanges, safe injection sites, drug checking services were virtually non-existent. The Russian government rejected harm reduction philosophy as enabling drug use, insisting that the only acceptable approach was complete abstinence. Cities that attempted to implement needle exchange programs faced federal pressure to shut down, accused of facilitating illegal activity. The few harm reduction services that existed operated underground, constantly threatened with raids and prosecution. Public health campaigns focused on fear rather than information. Government-produced anti-drug propaganda featured graphic images of Krokodil damage, accompanied by messages equating any drug use with inevitable death and moral corruption. These campaigns reached primarily people who weren't using drugs, while actual users never saw them or dismissed them as exaggerated. The propaganda did nothing to address why people use drugs, what drove them to inject gasoline, or how they might access help if they wanted it. Prevention efforts targeted schools with programs emphasizing criminal penalties and moral failure. Children learned that drugs were evil and users were criminals, but received no information about addiction as a medical condition, no education about what to do if they or someone they knew developed problems. The abstinence-only approach to drug education mirrored Russia's abstinence-only approach to sex education and achieved similarly poor results. Young people encountered drugs anyway, unprepared to make informed decisions or recognize warning signs of addiction. Treatment facilities that existed charged fees most addicts couldn't afford. A month-long rehabilitation program might cost 50,000 to 100,000 rubles, equivalent to 6 months' salary for someone with a low-wage job, completely impossible for the unemployed addicts who most needed services. Private clinics catering to wealthy Russians offered modern evidence-based treatment, but their services were accessible only to a tiny fraction of people suffering addiction. The system created a perverse situation where the rich could access effective treatment while the poor died from preventable complications. Insurance coverage for addiction treatment was minimal to non-existent. State health insurance, which theoretically covered all Russian citizens, specifically excluded or severely limited coverage for drug-related conditions. Private insurance similarly excluded addiction treatment or imposed lifetime caps so low they covered perhaps one detoxification attempt. Users needed either substantial personal wealth or family willing to bankrupt themselves for treatment, neither of which applied to most Krokodil users living in poverty. Medical professionals treating addiction face stigma within the healthcare system. Addiction medicine was considered a low-prestige specialty, attracting primarily doctors who couldn't compete for more desirable positions. The field received minimal research funding, outdated training standards, and little respect from other medical professionals. Talented doctors who might have advanced addiction treatment avoided the specialty entirely, choosing more prestigious and better compensated fields. The brain drain guaranteed that Russian addiction medicine lagged decades behind international standards. The few dedicated addiction specialists working in the system burned out rapidly from the combination of poor resources, high patient volumes, terrible outcomes, and social stigma. They watched patients cycle through inadequate treatment, relapse, return, and eventually die, unable to provide the level of care they knew was necessary. Many left the field entirely after a few years, replaced by less experienced practitioners or positions that went unfilled. The institutional knowledge that might have improved treatment over time was constantly depleted. Government funding for addiction treatment remained absurdly inadequate relative to the scale of the crisis. The budget allocated to all drug rehabilitation services across Russia was less than the cost of a single military aircraft, reflecting official priorities. Regional governments lacking federal support had even fewer resources, forcing local facilities to operate on shoestring budgets that barely covered staff salaries. Equipment broke and wasn't replaced. Buildings fell into disrepair, and services shrank even as demand exploded. Political will to address the crisis properly never materialized. Treating drug addicts was politically unpopular, seen as wasting resources on people who'd made bad choices and didn't deserve help. Politicians who suggested expanding treatment funding faced accusations of being soft on crime or enabling addiction. The electoral math favoured punitive approaches that played well with conservative voters, even though those approaches demonstrably failed to reduce addiction or prevent deaths. The Orthodox Church, influential in Russian society and politics, generally opposed harm reduction and modern addiction treatment. Religious leaders preached that addiction stemmed from spiritual weakness and moral failure, curable through prayer and willpower rather than medical intervention. Some church-affiliated rehabilitation programs offered faith-based treatment emphasizing sin and redemption, achieving results no better than secular programs, but providing religious authorities with evidence they were addressing the issue. The Church's opposition to medication-assisted treatment created additional political obstacles to implementing proven interventions. By 2014, the government's response to Krokodil had achieved nothing except making the situation worse for everyone involved. Users had less access to safer alternatives, no treatment options, and faced harsh criminal penalties. Medical systems remained overwhelmed with patients they couldn't adequately treat. The ban on codeine had driven prices up without reducing use, enriching criminals without helping addicts. The entire approach had been designed to punish rather than heal, control rather than help, and the results were exactly what anyone with knowledge of addiction medicine could have predicted. Failure on every measurable metric. Thousands continued dying annually from Krokodil and related complications while politicians declared the problem solved. The disconnect between official statements and ground reality was complete. In press releases, Russia was winning the war on drugs through tough enforcement and moral clarity. In hospital wards and morgues, Young people were rotting and dying at rates that would have triggered international humanitarian interventions if occurring in any other context. The government had chosen its approach and would maintain it regardless of outcomes, because admitting failure would require acknowledging that the entire philosophy underpinning Russian drug policy was fundamentally wrong. Western journalists discovered Krokodil in late 2012 and early 2013 when those viral medical photographs finally penetrated English-language media outlets. Time magazine published a feature in October 2013 titled "The Curse of the Crocodile," accompanied by photographs that made readers physically recoil from their screens. The article went viral immediately, shared millions of times across social media platforms by people simultaneously horrified and fascinated. Other major outlets scrambled to produce their own coverage, recognizing that Krokodil had all the elements of perfect sensational content: drugs, Russia, visible gore, and the exotic horror of something that seemed impossible in the modern world. The headlines competed for maximum shock value. "Zombie drug eats users alive," screamed across news websites. "The drug that turns you into a crocodile" appeared in tabloids alongside the most graphic available photographs. "Flesh-eating drug sweeps Russia" suggested an epidemic spreading like wildfire through the entire nation, threatening to engulf the world. The coverage focused obsessively on the physical horror, describing rotting flesh and exposed bones in lurid detail, while providing minimal context about why this was happening or what it revealed about addiction and social policy. Documentary filmmakers descended on Russia like vultures spotting carrion. Vice media, built on a business model of young correspondents experiencing dangerous situations for clicks, dispatched teams to film Krokodil users in their natural habitats. The resulting documentary featured shaky handheld footage of people injecting in abandoned buildings, close-up shots of rotting limbs, and interviews with users who spoke through translators about their inevitable deaths. The piece generated millions of views within days, establishing Vice's documentary style as the template others would follow. BBC, HBO, and other networks produced their own documentaries throughout 2013 and 2014. Film crews negotiated access to Russian hospitals, paying or bribing their way into wards where Krokodil patients lay dying. The cameras captured everything: amputations in progress, surgeons cutting through dead tissue, patients' faces contorted in agony as their wounds were cleaned without adequate pain medication. Medical staff, initially reluctant to be filmed, eventually cooperated because international attention might pressure the government to allocate more resources. The visual content was undeniably powerful. Viewers watching from comfortable Western homes saw young Russians with bones protruding through green-scaled skin, their bodies literally decomposing while still alive. The images carried an authenticity that written descriptions couldn't match, making the crisis real in ways that statistics never could. Millions of people who'd never thought about Russian drug policy suddenly had strong opinions about it, based primarily on having seen horrifying photographs. Social media amplified every new piece of content exponentially. Reddit threads about Krokodil accumulated thousands of comments, mixing genuine concern with morbid fascination and dark humor. YouTube videos about the drug-generated view counts in the tens of millions, their comment sections filled with people expressing shock, disgust, and superiority that such things happened in Russia rather than civilized Western countries. The algorithm recognized that Krokodil content kept viewers engaged, so it promoted more of the same, creating feedback loops of increasingly sensational coverage. Then the panic really started. Reports emerged of Krokodil cases in Germany during 2012, supposedly several users in Berlin and surrounding areas. German health authorities investigated, found a handful of cases involving desomorphine, or suspicious necrotic infections and issued cautious statements. The media transformed these cautious statements into screaming headlines. Krokodil reaches Europe. The implication was clear. The Russian plague was spreading westward, threatening to turn European cities into flesh-eating nightmares. Poland reported possible cases next. Then the United Kingdom, with several tabloids publishing stories about Krokodil appearing in British cities. The stories typically featured one or two anecdotal cases, often based on emergency room visits, where patients presented with necrotic wounds that doctors speculatively attributed to Krokodil without confirming the specific drug involved. The lack of confirmation didn't matter. The story was too good to fact-check rigorously. The United States experienced its own Krokodil panic during 2013 to 2014. News outlets reported cases in Illinois, Arizona, New York, and Oklahoma, suggesting the drug had established beachheads on American soil. Medical examiners and addiction specialists expressed skepticism, noting that most reported cases involved misdiagnosis of severe infections from black tar heroin or bath salts. The actual chemical analysis rarely found desomorphine, instead revealing conventional drug use complicated by dirty needles and poor injection hygiene. The panic revealed more about Western anxieties than actual drug trends. The idea of Krokodil spreading globally tapped into deep fears about Russian chaos contaminating the orderly West, about drug users as disease vectors carrying foreign plagues, about the breakdown of borders and social order. Conservative media outlets used Krokodil as evidence of moral decay, while liberal outlets pointed to it as proof that drug prohibition and lack of treatment access created nightmares. Everyone found confirmation of their existing beliefs in the rotting flesh. The reality was far less dramatic. Krokodil remained almost entirely confined to Russia and a few neighbouring countries because it only made sense under very specific conditions. The drug required easily accessible codeine, which most Western countries had already restricted or required prescriptions for. It offered advantages only when heroin was expensive or unavailable, but Western countries maintained relatively stable heroin supplies through established trafficking routes. Most importantly, Western countries had significantly better addiction treatment infrastructure, giving users alternatives to cooking gasoline mixtures in kitchens. The economic calculations didn't work outside Russia. In the United States or Western Europe, heroin was readily available at prices addicts could manage through crime or panhandling. Prescription opioids like oxycodone could be diverted from legitimate supplies. Fentanyl was flooding markets, providing a much stronger high without requiring home chemistry. The effort to synthesize Krokodil made no sense when better alternatives existed, which explained why it never truly established itself in Western drug markets despite media predictions. The few genuine Western cases involved Russian immigrants or travellers who'd brought the practice with them, continuing use patterns established before arrival. These represented isolated incidents rather than the beginning of an epidemic. Health authorities in multiple countries investigated, found minimal evidence of spreading use, and issued reassuring statements that the media largely ignored because panic generated more clicks than reassurance. YouTube became the primary platform for Krokodil content distribution. Channels specializing in drug-related content produced videos with titles like "The Scariest Drug in the World" and "Krokodil, the Drug That Eats You Alive," featuring compilation footage of the most graphic images available. Some channels presented the content as education or harm reduction. Others were transparent exploitation designed purely for views and advertising revenue. The videos accumulated millions of views collectively, introducing teenagers and young adults to Krokodil through autoplay algorithms that prioritized shocking content. The ethical questions went largely unasked. Nobody seemed concerned about whether displaying photographs of mutilated Russian addicts without their consent violated basic human dignity. The subjects of these viral images had not agreed to become international symbols of drug horror, yet their destroyed bodies circulated endlessly through media ecosystems that profited from their suffering. Some were dead by the time their photographs went viral, unable to consent or object. Others were alive but so consumed by addiction and illness that meaningful consent was impossible. Documentary filmmakers defended their work as raising awareness and pressuring authorities to act. The Vice documentary team argued they'd given voice to people society ignored, making their suffering visible when Russian authorities wanted it hidden. The argument had merit. The international attention did eventually force some policy changes and increased pressure for better treatment funding. But it was also true that the documentaries sensationalised suffering for commercial purposes, that Vice profited handsomely from views and the edgy reputation the content provided. The carnival atmosphere around Krokodil coverage treated suffering humans as spectacle. Viewers consumed the horror like entertainment, clicking through galleries of destroyed bodies with the same casual interest they might browse vacation photos. Comment sections filled with gallows humour and judgmental statements about drug users deserving their fate. The people in the photographs became abstractions, teaching moments, examples of what not to do rather than individuals who'd experienced poverty, trauma and addiction in a country that abandoned them. The media frenzy actually obscured the real story. The sensational focus on rotting flesh distracted from systemic failures that created conditions where Krokodil could emerge. Coverage emphasized individual choices and moral failings rather than examining why Russia had millions of opiate addicts, why treatment infrastructure was non-existent, why economic collapse and hopelessness drove people to such desperate measures. The narrative became about Russian barbarity and the inherent dangers of drugs, missing entirely the lessons about prohibition, poverty, and public health. Western audiences emerged from the coverage believing they understood Krokodil, when actually they'd been fed a simplified horror story that confirmed existing biases. Russia was portrayed as backward and chaotic, drug users as making incomprehensibly stupid choices, and the solution as obvious: just say no and punish those who don't. The complexity of addiction, the structural factors enabling epidemics, and the failure of punitive approaches received minimal attention because they didn't generate clicks or fit comfortably into soundbite explanations. Some coverage was genuinely informative, providing context about post-Soviet collapse, the heroin crackdown that preceded Krokodil's emergence, and the systematic defunding of addiction treatment. But these nuanced pieces struggled to compete with sensational content in the attention economy. A thoughtful 3,000-word analysis of Russian drug policy couldn't match the viral potential of a gallery titled "The 25 Most Horrifying Krokodil Photos Ever," accompanied by graphic images designed to maximize shock. The peak of Western media attention occurred during 2013-2014, then faded as quickly as it arrived. By 2015, Krokodil stories appeared less frequently, replaced by new drug panics about synthetic cannabinoids, bath salts, and the emerging fentanyl crisis. The attention span of global media had moved on, satisfied that it had adequately covered the Russian flesh-eating drug story. The actual Russians still suffering and dying from Krokodil received no further coverage, their crisis reduced to a solved problem or yesterday's news. The legacy of the media spectacle was mixed at best. International pressure did contribute to some Russian policy changes, though not the fundamental reforms needed to actually address addiction effectively. Millions of people became aware that Krokodil existed, though few understood the conditions that created it or the lessons it offered about drug policy. The graphic images remained permanently online, continuing to circulate years later whenever someone wanted to illustrate the horrors of drug use. The people in those photographs never consented to becoming global symbols. They didn't choose to have their destroyed bodies displayed for millions of viewers, discussed in comment sections, used as clickbait for advertising revenue. Many were dead by the time their images achieved viral status. Others lived with the knowledge that strangers around the world had seen their most vulnerable, degraded moments captured in high-resolution colour. The media took their suffering and commodified it, profited from it, then moved on to the next horror without considering the humans left behind. Somewhere a video still plays on autoplay, showing a young Russian man's arm with exposed bone, viewed by a teenager in suburban America who clicks through to the next video without thinking deeply about what they just witnessed. The algorithm registers the view, categorizes the engagement, and queues up more shocking content. The spectacle continues, disconnected from the human reality it supposedly documented, existing now primarily as content in the great machine that converts suffering into clicks, clicks into revenue, revenue into incentives for finding new horrors to feed the audience. The global panic about Krokodil spreading worldwide turned out to be exactly that. Panic rather than reality. But the real epidemic in Russia continued. Quieter now without international cameras, people still injecting gasoline and rotting alive in the same cities where the documentaries were filmed. The media got its story and moved on. The dying got no story at all, just the same addiction, the same withdrawal, the same impossible choices that had driven them to Krokodil in the first place. The desomorphine molecule itself isn't the flesh eater, which sounds counterintuitive until you understand what actually enters the bloodstream during a Krokodil injection. Pure pharmaceutical-grade desomorphine, the compound Swiss chemists synthesized in 1932, is simply a powerful opiate with a short duration of action. Users injecting pure desomorphine would experience intense euphoria, followed by standard opiate side effects, respiratory depression, constipation, addiction, but not tissue necrosis. The horror comes from everything else in the mixture, the toxic soup of industrial chemicals that home synthesis leaves behind. The chemistry of Krokodil production creates a perfect storm of tissue destruction. When users heat codeine with iodine and red phosphorus, they're essentially performing a reduction reaction that strips specific chemical groups from the codeine molecule to create desomorphine. The reaction produces hydroiodic acid as an intermediate, a corrosive substance that burns through organic tissue on contact. Most of this acid remains in the final product, because users don't neutralize or wash it out. They simply inject everything in the cooking vessel directly into their veins. Red phosphorus contributes its own nightmare. The substance scraped from matchbox striking strips contains numerous contaminants, including various phosphorus compounds, binding agents, and colorants never meant for human consumption. When heated during synthesis, red phosphorus can convert partially to white phosphorus, one of the most toxic substances known to chemistry. White phosphorus causes necrosis on contact, damages bones, and destroys liver and kidney tissue systemically. The amounts involved are small but cumulative, building up with each injection until reaching toxic thresholds. Iodine accumulates in tissue, particularly the thyroid gland, which concentrates iodine naturally. Repeated injections deliver massive doses far exceeding what the body can process safely. Excess iodine causes thyroid dysfunction, damages blood vessel walls, and contributes to the dark discoloration of skin around injection sites. The element's antiseptic properties, useful for cleaning wounds, become destructive when delivered in concentrated form directly to tissue via bloodstream. Gasoline and paint thinner serve as solvents during synthesis, but never fully evaporate from the final product. These organic compounds consist of dozens of different hydrocarbons and additives, none of them compatible with human biology. When injected, gasoline molecules disperse into surrounding tissue where they accumulate in fat cells and cause chronic inflammation. The body has no efficient mechanism to break down or eliminate gasoline, so it simply stores the poison while trying desperately to isolate it from healthy tissue. The hydrocarbon solvents particularly destroy blood vessel walls. The chemicals dissolve lipids that form cell membranes, effectively melting the boundaries between cells and bloodstream. Blood vessels weakened by repeated solvent exposure develop inflammation called thrombophlebitis. The walls swell, blood clots form, and the vessels collapse entirely. Once a vein collapses, blood flow to downstream tissue stops completely. Without oxygen, cells begin dying within minutes. Heavy metal contamination adds another layer of toxicity. Phosphorus compounds, iodine complexes, and various metals from codeine pill binders accumulate in bones and organs. Lead, cadmium, and other toxic elements can leach from matchbox striking strips during the cooking process. These metals integrate into bone structure, causing brittleness and interfering with bone marrow's ability to produce blood cells. Users develop anemia as red blood cell production drops, leaving them pale and fatigued even before visible necrosis begins. The pH of the injection mixture is catastrophically acidic, combining hydroiodic acid, hydrochloric acid, and various organic acids from the synthesis without any neutralization, creates a solution acidic enough to cause chemical burns. Injecting this directly into veins is equivalent to injecting diluted battery acid. The immediate tissue damage triggers massive inflammatory responses as the immune system attempts to contain what it perceives as a chemical attack, which is precisely what's happening. The cascade of destruction follows a predictable biological pattern. The acidic, toxic mixture hits the bloodstream and immediately damages blood vessel walls at the injection site. The damaged vessels release inflammatory signals, recruiting immune cells to the area. White blood cells arrive and attempt to fight what they interpret as an infection, releasing enzymes and chemicals designed to kill bacteria, but which damage surrounding tissue indiscriminately. Blood flow slows as vessels narrow from inflammation and thrombosis formation. Clots develop as platelets respond to damaged vessel walls, attempting to seal breaches but instead blocking the already compromised blood flow. The combination of narrowed vessels and clot formation creates a scenario where tissue downstream from the injection site receives progressively less oxygen. Hypoxia, insufficient oxygen, triggers a switch to anaerobic metabolism in cells, which produces toxic waste products that accelerate damage. Within hours, cells begin dying en masse through a process called necrosis. Unlike apoptosis, the controlled cell death the body uses to eliminate damaged cells safely, necrosis is violent and inflammatory. Dying cells rupture, spilling their contents into surrounding tissue. These cellular contents include enzymes, proteins, and other molecules that damage neighboring healthy cells, triggering a cascade where cell death spreads outward from the initial injection site like falling dominoes. Bacteria colonize the dying tissue within days. The skin normally hosts billions of bacteria kept in check by immune defenses and the physical barrier of healthy skin. When tissue dies, the barrier breaks down and bacteria invade freely. Staphylococcus aureus, including antibiotic-resistant Marseille strains common in Russia, thrives in necrotic tissue. Anaerobic bacteria that normally can't survive in oxygenated tissue flourish in the oxygen-depleted zones where blood flow is stopped. The bacterial infections accelerate tissue destruction exponentially. Bacteria release toxins and digestive enzymes designed to break down organic matter for nutrition. These same enzymes liquefy human tissue, converting solid muscle into putrid fluid. The immune system attempts to fight the infection, but cannot penetrate areas where blood flow has ceased. Antibiotics administered systemically also fail to reach the infected tissue, rendering treatment largely ineffective unless combined with surgical removal of all dead material. Bone infection develops once necrosis reaches skeletal depth. Osteomyelitis occurs when bacteria invade bone tissue and marrow, establishing colonies that are extraordinarily difficult to eliminate even with appropriate antibiotics. The infection causes intense pain as inflammation builds pressure inside the rigid bone structure. Affected bones become fragile and prone to pathological fractures that occur from minimal stress. The infection can persist for years, requiring months of intravenous antibiotics and often repeated surgeries to remove infected bone segments. The immune system collapses under the sustained assault. The combination of repeated toxic insults, chronic bacterial infections, malnutrition from addiction, and the immunosuppressive effects of opiates themselves devastates the body's defensive capabilities. White blood cell counts plummet as bone marrow damage impairs production. The remaining immune cells become exhausted, unable to mount effective responses to new threats. Users become susceptible to opportunistic infections, tuberculosis, pneumonia, fungal diseases, that healthy immune systems easily control. Comparing Krokodil to other dangerous drugs reveals its unique horror. Black tar heroin, despite its impurities and contamination, rarely causes tissue necrosis unless injection technique introduces bacteria or users share needles. The heroin itself, while deadly through overdose and addiction, doesn't actively destroy tissue the way Krokodil's chemical contaminants do. Users can inject heroin for years or decades with proper technique and harm reduction measures, whereas Krokodil guarantees tissue destruction within weeks. Methamphetamine causes severe health problems including cardiovascular damage, dental decay, and psychological issues, but the drug doesn't cause flesh to rot off bones. Bath salts and synthetic cannabinoids produce dangerous intoxication and occasionally prompt violent behavior, yet they don't create the predictable tissue necrosis that Krokodil guarantees. Even fentanyl, exponentially more deadly by overdose potential, kills quickly rather than causing months of progressive decomposition. The critical difference is that Krokodil users inject concentrated poisons repeatedly throughout each day. A heroin user might inject twice daily with relatively pure drug. A Krokodil user injects 4 to 6 times daily, with a mixture that's perhaps 5% desomorphin and 95% toxic waste. Each injection deposits more gasoline, more acid, more heavy metals, more iodine. The cumulative toxic load increases exponentially, overwhelming the body's already compromised ability to process and eliminate poisons. The short duration of desomorphine's effects creates the fatal pattern of repeated dosing. If the high lasted 8 hours like heroin, users might inject twice daily, giving their bodies time to attempt damage control between doses. But 90 minutes to 2 hours means the withdrawal symptoms return before tissues have even begun addressing the damage from the previous injection. The addiction demands another dose, which delivers fresh chemicals to already compromised tissue, accelerating the cascade of destruction. The body attempts compensatory mechanisms that only worsen the situation. Inflammation designed to isolate and eliminate threats instead creates swelling that compresses blood vessels, reducing flow further. Clotting mechanisms meant to stop bleeding instead occlude vessels completely. Immune responses intended to fight infection cause collateral damage to healthy tissue. Every defensive system the body employs backfires when facing a threat for which evolution provided no preparation. Injected industrial solvents and acids. The progression is mechanically inevitable once certain thresholds are crossed. After sufficient blood vessels have collapsed, oxygen delivery drops below the level needed to sustain tissue. Once anaerobic metabolism dominates, the accumulation of toxic metabolic waste accelerates cell death. When bacterial infection establishes itself in dead tissue, The exponential growth of bacterial populations outpaces any immune response. The body cannot stop the cascade without radical intervention. Amputation to remove all affected tissue, massive antibiotics, supportive care. Even then, success isn't guaranteed. Organ damage occurs systemically as the toxic chemicals circulate. The liver, responsible for filtering blood and neutralizing poisons, becomes overwhelmed by the sheer volume and variety of toxins. Hepatocytes, liver cells, die from chemical exposure, reducing the liver's capacity to process anything, including the drugs users are injecting. Kidney function deteriorates as toxic compounds damage the delicate filtration structures. Once liver and kidney function decline sufficiently, the body loses its ability to eliminate any toxins, causing a spiraling cascade of system failure. The cardiovascular system suffers catastrophic damage from repeated toxic exposure. Heart valves can become infected with bacteria circulating in the bloodstream, causing endocarditis that's fatal if untreated. The heart muscle itself becomes damaged by toxic compounds, reducing pumping efficiency. Blood chemistry becomes so deranged that normal metabolism is impossible. Electrolyte imbalances, acid-base disturbances, coagulation abnormalities. The blood that reaches tissue is increasingly incapable of sustaining life even if flow is adequate. The respiratory system fails as lungs become damaged by circulating toxins and opportunistic infections. Pneumonia develops in immunocompromised users, filling lungs with fluid and inflammatory cells that prevent oxygen exchange. Some users develop pulmonary emboli, blood clots that break free from injection sites and lodge in lung arteries, blocking blood flow and causing sudden death. The lungs' ability to oxygenate blood progressively declines, starving all organs including the brain. Neurological damage occurs through multiple mechanisms. Strokes happen when infected clots from injection sites travel to brain arteries and block flow, killing brain tissue. Toxic compounds in high concentrations can cross the blood-brain barrier and directly damage neurons. Chronic infections can spread to brain tissue or the protective membrane surrounding it, causing meningitis or brain abscesses. The cognitive decline in chronic Krokodil users reflects progressive brain damage from inadequate oxygen, toxic exposure and infection. The bitter irony is that the ingredients making Krokodil easy to synthesize are precisely the ingredients that make it a flesh-eating nightmare. If proper laboratory solvents were required, fewer people could make it. If purification steps were necessary for the drug to work, users would have to remove the toxins. If the synthesis required rare chemicals or complex procedures, the barrier to entry would prevent most attempts. Instead, the recipe is optimized for accessibility, using common household chemicals and requiring no special equipment, creating a path where desperate addicts can destroy themselves with maximum efficiency. The science reveals no mystery about why Krokodil causes such horrific damage. The mystery is why anyone would inject gasoline after the first few users demonstrated the inevitable consequences. But addiction provides that answer. The brain hijacked by opiates doesn't process risk rationally, and withdrawal is immediate while tissue death is delayed. By the time consequences become undeniable, physical dependence ensures that stopping seems worse than continuing. The chemistry is straightforward. The tragedy is watching people understand the chemistry and inject anyway because addiction has made choice an illusion. The headlines stopped screaming about Krokodil around 2014 to 2015, the media carnival packing up and moving to the next horror show with the attention span of a distracted child. Western journalists stopped filing stories from Russian hospitals, documentary crews found new subjects, and the viral photographs gradually aged into internet archaeology. The silence suggested the crisis had resolved, that Russia had somehow defeated the flesh-eating drug through policy changes or medical breakthroughs. The reality was far less satisfying. Krokodil simply stopped being news while the drug continued destroying people in regions nobody was watching anymore. The epidemic did decline from its peak, but not because of any brilliant intervention. Russia's tightened codeine regulations made the drug harder to cook, raising costs and creating barriers that pushed some users toward alternatives. More significantly, heroin supply routes from Afghanistan partially recovered by 2014 to 2015, as the government realized that completely eliminating heroin just created worse problems. The criminal networks adapted to enforcement pressure, finding new trafficking corridors and methods that restored heroin availability in many regions. Prices dropped as supply stabilized, making heroin competitive with Krokodil again. Users who'd switched to desomorphine out of economic necessity switched back when heroin became accessible and affordable. The transition saved lives in the immediate sense. Heroin kills through overdose but doesn't guarantee tissue necrosis, though it simply substituted one addiction for another without addressing underlying causes. The government could claim victory over Krokodil while ignoring that they'd just shifted the problem back to the original crisis they'd tried to solve in the first place. But Krokodil never actually disappeared. The drug persists in pockets of rural Russia, where conditions remain exactly as desperate as they were during the peak epidemic. Small Siberian towns, isolated industrial cities, regions where unemployment still exceeds 30%, and heroin costs more than local economies can support. In these areas, users continue cooking codeine with gasoline because the fundamental calculations haven't changed. People still need relief from withdrawal. Codeine is still obtainable through black markets or remaining legal loopholes, and the recipe still circulates through communities bound by shared addiction. The current scale is impossible to determine precisely. Russian health authorities don't track Krokodil use systematically, hospitals don't report cases under that specific name, and media outlets no longer investigate drug trends in forgotten regions. Anecdotal evidence from addiction specialists suggests hundreds, or perhaps low thousands of active users remain, down dramatically from peak levels but still representing ongoing tragedy. Each user follows the familiar trajectory: initial injections, developing necrosis, hospital visits or death, rarely recovery. The pattern repeats without international cameras to document it. A new and potentially worse crisis has emerged to replace Krokodil in many regions. Synthetic opioids, particularly fentanyl and its chemical cousins, flooded Russian drug markets during the mid to late 2010s. These substances are far more potent than heroin, cheaper to produce and smuggle, and catastrophically easy to overdose on. Fentanyl kills instantly through respiratory arrest rather than slowly through tissue destruction, trading one horror for another. Many former Krokodil users who survived with amputated limbs and permanent disabilities now face new risks from fentanyl-contaminated drug supplies. The fentanyl crisis demonstrated that the Krokodil epidemic taught authorities nothing valuable about addressing addiction. The response to fentanyl followed identical patterns: criminalization, aggressive enforcement, minimal treatment investment, punitive rather than medical approaches. Russia continues maintaining some of the world's strictest drug policies while having some of the highest addiction rates. The correlation between harsh penalties and poor outcomes is clear to anyone examining the data objectively, but policy remains driven by ideology rather than evidence. Western countries learned the wrong lessons as well. The Krokodil panic convinced many that the drug war was working precisely because such horrors emerged in Russia rather than domestically. American and European politicians pointed to Krokodil as evidence that their drug policies, while imperfect, at least prevented flesh-eating epidemics. The argument conveniently ignored that the West faced its own opioid crisis through prescription drugs and increasingly contaminated heroin supplies, just with different visible symptoms. The fundamental lesson Krokodil teaches is that prohibition without treatment creates innovation in hell. When authorities eliminate one drug without addressing why people use drugs, desperate addicts will create something to fill the void. The substitute is almost always worse than the original because it's produced in unregulated conditions by people prioritizing immediate relief over long-term safety. Krokodil existed because heroin became inaccessible, just as crack cocaine emerged when powder cocaine was too expensive for poor users. Desperate people with chemistry knowledge and access to toxic chemicals will synthesize drugs regardless of consequences. The only question is whether society provides safer alternatives and treatment, or forces them into increasingly dangerous experimentation. Russia chose enforcement over treatment and got gasoline-laced desomorphine. Other countries making similar choices are courting their own innovations in self-destruction, possibly something that makes Krokodil look gentle by comparison. The pattern repeats globally with minor variations. China faces synthetic cathinone problems. The United States struggles with fentanyl analogues. Southeast Asian countries battle methamphetamine variants. Each crisis emerges from the same root conditions: untreated addiction, meeting prohibition, meeting criminal innovation. The substances differ, but the fundamental dynamics are identical. Krokodil was neither the first nor the last example of what happens when drug policy prioritizes punishment over public health. Treatment remains the missing element in nearly every country's approach. Russia has marginally improved treatment access since the peak Krokodil years, but resources remain absurdly inadequate relative to need. Medication-assisted treatment remains restricted, harm reduction faces ideological opposition, and the stigma surrounding addiction prevents people from seeking help until death is imminent. Western countries often have better infrastructure, but still treat addiction primarily as a criminal justice issue, requiring punishment rather than a medical condition requiring treatment. The critical insight is that addressing root causes, poverty, hopelessness, trauma, mental illness, matters more than fighting specific drugs. Krokodil emerged in regions devastated by economic collapse, where people saw no future worth staying sober for. Eliminating the drug without addressing why people wanted to escape their lives accomplishes nothing except ensuring they find alternative escape methods. Comprehensive approaches combining economic development, mental health services, accessible addiction treatment, and harm reduction can reduce drug deaths dramatically, but require sustained investment and political will that rarely materializes. The cost-benefit analysis is stark. Russia spends billions on drug enforcement, while addiction treatment receives a fraction of that funding. The money spent imprisoning drug users could fund comprehensive treatment programs that would actually reduce addiction rates and associated harms. The political calculation favors enforcement because voters want to punish drug users, and treatment seems like coddling criminals. The human cost of this political calculation includes thousands dead from Krokodil, and countless others destroyed by drugs that emerge because treatment wasn't available. Harm reduction represents the pragmatic middle ground that ideology prevents most countries from embracing fully. Needle exchanges, safe injection sites, drug checking services and education programs don't encourage drug use. They reduce deaths while keeping users connected to services that might eventually lead to recovery. The evidence supporting harm reduction is overwhelming, but opponents characterize it as enabling addiction, making political implementation difficult even when the science is clear. The Krokodil crisis posed a straightforward question: how many people must rot alive before society acknowledges that treatment works better than imprisonment? The answer, apparently, is that thousands dying wasn't enough. The epidemic has faded from consciousness without prompting fundamental policy changes in Russia or inspiring better approaches elsewhere. The lessons were available for learning, but went unlearned because accepting them would require admitting that decades of drug policy were catastrophically misguided. The broader implications extend beyond addiction to how society treats vulnerable populations. Krokodil users were poor, marginalized, struggling with mental illness and trauma, abandoned by social safety nets, and given no path forward except self-destruction. Their suffering could have prompted examination of the social conditions creating such desperation. Instead, it prompted moral judgment about poor choices, reinforcing existing stigma while doing nothing to address underlying problems. The international community watched Russians inject gasoline and responded primarily with horror and fascination rather than reflection about how their own countries treat addiction. The implicit narrative was that such barbarity could only happen in Russia, a convenient fiction that allowed Western countries to avoid examining their own failures. Meanwhile, Americans were dying from prescription opioids at epidemic rates. Europeans faced rising drug deaths, and every developed country struggled with untreated addiction despite having resources Russia lacked. Krokodil represents the ultimate endpoint of untreated addiction, intersecting with poverty, chemistry, and accessible toxic chemicals. The drug is the logical conclusion of policies that punish rather than heal, that force people into choosing between excruciating withdrawal and self-administered poison. Every policy choice that prioritizes enforcement over treatment moves closer to creating conditions where Krokodil or something similar can emerge. The story has no satisfying ending because the underlying problems remain unresolved. Someone in rural Russia right now is probably crushing codeine pills, scraping phosphorus from matchboxes, pouring gasoline into a cooking vessel. They know the risks because the information is available, because they've seen other users with rotting limbs, because the warnings have been delivered loudly and repeatedly. They're doing it anyway because withdrawal is immediate and unbearable, while tissue death is delayed and gradual. That person might die within 2 years, might lose limbs before achieving sobriety, might never access treatment because it doesn't exist in their region, or costs more than they could ever afford. Their death or disfigurement will add to statistics nobody tracks carefully, contributing to a crisis nobody considers newsworthy anymore. The tragedy is not that Krokodil exists. The tragedy is that the conditions creating it persist unchanged, while society congratulates itself on moving past the epidemic. The next innovation in addictive self-destruction is being developed right now in some basement or kitchen or laboratory, created by people desperate enough to try anything and clever enough to synthesize it. The drug might be worse than Krokodil, might cause different horrors we haven't imagined yet, might emerge in different countries under different names. But it will emerge somewhere because the fundamental dynamics driving people to inject poison remain unaddressed. Prohibition creates scarcity. Scarcity creates price increases. Price increases create demand for cheaper alternatives. Desperate people with chemistry knowledge create those alternatives. The alternatives are invariably more dangerous than what they replace. Deaths mount, authorities crack down harder, and the cycle accelerates. This pattern has repeated throughout the entire history of drug prohibition, and Krokodil was simply one particularly visible iteration. Breaking the cycle requires acknowledging that addiction is a medical condition requiring treatment, that harm reduction saves lives, that addressing poverty and hopelessness matters more than criminal penalties, and that the current approach has failed by every measurable metric. These acknowledgements are politically difficult, ideologically uncomfortable, and require sustained investment without immediate visible results. So most countries maintain failed policies while hoping their citizens never become desperate enough to cook gasoline-based drugs in their kitchens. The Krokodil story is not about Russia or drugs or bad decisions. It's about what happens when society abandons its most vulnerable people and forces them to choose between suffering and self-destruction. It's about systems that create desperation, then punish the desperate for their survival strategies. It's about the willingness to watch thousands die slowly, rather than admit that our approach to addiction is fundamentally wrong and always has been. Somewhere right now, someone is preparing their next injection. The mixture is brown and reeks of gasoline. They know it will accelerate their decay by another increment, moving them closer to exposed bones and amputation and death. They're injecting it anyway because 90 minutes of relief seems worth any future cost when the present is unbearable. The needle enters a vein, the plunger depresses, and the toxic soup enters their bloodstream. Tomorrow they'll need to inject again, and again, and again, until they can't anymore.